Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. That was Harry S. Truman pouring his heart out to reporters on April 13th, 1945. This was literally just one day after the sudden, shocking death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Truman was completely overwhelmed, and honestly, so is the rest of the world.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into the life and presidency of a guy who never really wanted the top job. A man from Missouri with supposedly limited political talents, who is just suddenly thrust into power at arguably the most critical juncture of the 20th century. Somehow, Harry S. Truman became an architect of the modern world, making some of the most monumental and heavily debated decisions in all of human history. All right, let's get right into it. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at his sudden accession to power, then ending the Second World War, containing the Soviet threat, rebuilding with the Marshall Plan, his domestic fair deal, and finally, the upset of the century.
Section 1. Thrust into the presidency.
To really understand Truman's mindset, we have to grasp just how wildly unprepared he was made to be for the Oval Office. Think about how compressed these world-altering events were. He'd been vice president for exactly 82 days when FDR died. In that short time, he was pretty much kept in the dark. Actually, he hadn't even been informed about the top-secret atomic bomb project yet. So suddenly in April, he's the president. By July, he's at the Potsdam Conference, sitting right across from Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, hashing out the entire post-war order. I mean, they're carving up the division of Germany and the borders of Poland. Right in the middle of that conference, he gets word of the successful Trinity atomic test. And then by August, he makes the most consequential military decision in human history. So yeah, it's pretty easy to understand why he felt the weight of all the planets on his shoulders.
Moving on to Section 2. Ending the Second World War.
So Truman's absolute overriding priority right out of the gate was defeating Japan while keeping American casualties to a minimum. His decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is, of course, heavily debated to this very day. On one side, you have Truman's argument. Years later, he maintained that the bombings were absolutely crucial to ending the war swiftly. He calculated that it saved roughly 125,000 American youngsters and another 125,000 Japanese youngsters from dying in a massive, drawn-out invasion of the mainland. Plus, ending the war fast stopped the Soviet Union from grabbing more Japanese-held territory. But then, on the other side, you have critics like Allied commander and eventually Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower. They argued the nuclear weapons were totally unnecessary. Their view was that conventional tactics, like the naval blockades and intense firebombing that were already happening, would have eventually forced Japan's surrender. Whatever side of the debate you look at, the sheer gravity of this choice permanently altered the nature of global warfare.
Section 3. Containing the Soviet threat. Even before the dust of World War II had fully settled, this entirely new conflict was already brewing. By September 1946, Truman was absolutely convinced that trying to cooperate with the Soviet Union was a lost cause. So, his administration adopted a brand new strategy: containment. This was based on a famous 1946 cable sent by diplomat George F. Kennan. The core idea here was that the Soviet Union was an uncompromising regime, right? So instead of trying to play nice and maintain a friendly détente, or going to the other extreme and aggressively attacking them to win back territory, which they called rollback, the U.S. would take a firm middle ground. They would simply, but forcefully, prevent any further expansion of Soviet influence anywhere in the world. So how did this idea turn into action? Well, enter the Truman Doctrine. In March 1947, the British government essentially threw up their hands and said they could no longer afford to help Greece fight off a communist insurgency. Truman didn't hesitate. He stepped right in, went straight to Congress, and asked for an unprecedented $400 million aid package for both Greece and Turkey. He laid it all out, famously declaring that it had to be the policy of the United States to support free people who were resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. But this wasn't just about cutting a check. This was huge. It marked a permanent, massive pivot away from America's traditional pre-World War II isolationism. From that moment on, the U.S. was officially stepping up as the global backstop against communism. Section 4. Rebuilding with the Marshall Plan. Now, dropping military support was really only half of the equation. To actually contain communism, the administration believed you had to wipe out the desperate economic conditions where it tended to take root. Get a load of this massive figure, over $12.4 billion. That is the staggering amount of money the U.S. Congress eventually doled out over 4 years to fund the Marshall Plan.
Europe was completely devastated, and Truman's team knew that if they left it in economic chaos, it would just be an open invitation for Soviet expansion. To actually get this giant sum approved by a conservative-controlled Congress, they argued it would halt the chaos, literally sustain Western civilization, and, as a bonus, boost trade for American businesses.
But, of course, this money came with strings attached, big ones. The Marshall Plan wasn't just some blank check. To get the cash, foreign governments basically had to push communists entirely out of their ranks. Socialist economic policies were strongly discouraged, and balancing the budget was heavily favored. On top of all that, countries had to accept the reindustrialization of Germany. Now here's a wild detail. The US actually offered these funds to the Soviet Union too, but they did it knowing full well that Stalin would never agree to these capitalist-leaning rules. And sure enough, he rejected it. He even banned his satellite states from taking the money, setting up his own competing Molotov plan instead. So through pure economic policy, the split between the Eastern and Western blocs was effectively set in stone.
Section 5, the Fair Deal and Equality. Okay, so while Truman was busy architecting an entirely new world order overseas, things back home were, well, they were a mess. Extremely turbulent. He was a Democrat, very much in the tradition of FDR, and he really wanted to push domestic policy even further. Building on the famous New Deal, Truman rolled out his own super ambitious liberal agenda, which he called the Fair Deal. He was pushing for a national healthcare system, higher minimum wages, and federal money for education. But he hit a massive wall. A conservative coalition in Congress blocked almost everything. They even passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which heavily stripped back labor union powers, and they did it by overriding Truman's own veto. One of his only major wins on the home front was the Housing Act of 1949, which finally pumped money into slum clearance and low-income housing. And speaking of labor unions, wow, the transition from a booming wartime economy back to peacetime was absolutely brutal. By February 1946, you had nearly 2 million workers out on strike across the country. And when national railroad workers threatened to strike and shut down the entire U.S. rail system, Truman's response was, frankly, intense. Listen to this. First, he just outright seized the railroads. Then, when they went ahead and struck anyway, halting something like 24,000 freight trains a day, an absolutely furious Truman went before Congress. He literally threatened to draft the striking railroad workers directly into the army just to force them back to work. The strike actually got settled while he was standing there giving the speech, but it really shows the authoritarian level measures he was willing to entertain just to keep the country moving. But even in the middle of these bitter political street fights, Truman made a deeply moral, uncompromising pivot on civil rights. In 1948, he issued Executive Order 9981. This was a massive historic mandate that ordered equal treatment and opportunity across the armed services. He effectively desegregated the American military. It was a huge step forward that completely shaped the modern military we know today. But politically, it caused an earthquake. It absolutely infuriated the white conservative Southern wing of his own Democratic Party, causing a massive fracture right as he was gearing up for his re-election campaign. Which brings us to Section 6, the upset of the century. So, setting the stage for the 1948 election, it's the ultimate showdown. And Truman was, to put it mildly, wildly unpopular. His party was falling apart. Strom Thurmond broke off to run as a segregationist Dixiecrat in the South, and Henry Wallace ran from the left for the Progressive Party. Literally, everyone expected the Republican nominee, Thomas Dewey, to just cruise to an easy victory. It was so certain that polling companies actually stopped taking polls weeks before the election. They thought it was in the bag. But Truman refused to quit. He launched this grueling whistle-stop train campaign, riding all over the country, leaning out the back of the train and delivering these fiery, off-the-cuff speeches directly to the voters. And it worked. That massive number there, 303, is the Electoral College victory Truman magically pulled off against Dewey's 189. It was unreal. This upset was so completely unexpected that the Chicago Tribune, which had to go to press early, had already printed their morning edition with this legendary, totally wrong headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." 2 days after the election, Truman is at a train stop in St. Louis, and someone hands him a copy of the paper. He holds it right up for the cameras, just flashing this massive, triumphant grin. It's still one of the most famous political photos ever taken. It just perfectly captures the sheer, unfiltered joy of a man who everyone had counted out entirely too soon. So when you look back at it all, we're left with this incredibly complex, fascinating legacy.
Harry S. Truman, a guy from Missouri with supposedly limited talents, ended up rebuilding a devastated Europe, setting the ground rules for the Cold War, unleashing the atomic age, and taking a massive stand on civil rights, all while fighting bitter daily gridlock back home. It really leaves us with this final thought. How does a reluctant leader manage to architect the free world abroad while battling relentless opposition at home? And more importantly, what does that teach us about the true nature of presidential power? Think about that for a while. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning history.